Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. I have a fantastic interview for you that I've been holding on to a little. So to timestamp this, I recorded this interview a few weeks ago. It is with Ben Judah. He served as special advisor to David Lammy, the former Foreign Secretary, who was reshuffled into Justice. Now, after that, Ben Judah quit. He was formerly at the Atlantic Council. Many of you may even know him the way I first knew him, which is he wrote great books about London. He's a very versatile, thoughtful, as you'll see in this interview, brilliant mind on all things foreign policy. He has a great perspective on not just transatlantic relations, but I guess the whole gamut. Britain's relationship with Europe, Britain's relationship with Australia, and as you'll hear in this interview, Britain's relationship with CANZUK. So we recorded this interview before this week's shock resignation of John Healey from the defence portfolio over this row about defence spending. But of course, I was asking him about all the themes that led up to this resignation. And we have a very good and thorough discussion about some of the fault lines in British politics and Labor's inability to deal with the challenges it is confronting. Let's get straight into it. Ben Judah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Now, I remember when you were appointed and you joined David Lammy's office. And the reason I remember this is because you were at the Atlantic Council in DC. It seems like you had a terrific position there. You're coming back to serve your country and an incoming government. What did you want to achieve in terms of the UK's foreign policy? And more importantly, how successful do you think you were, given that Trump comes in and just railroads through this government's agenda?
So there was a sort of personal motivation and I guess an ideological motivation to doing what I did. The personal motivation was that there's not just a sort of biological clock in life, there's a sort of do something clock. And I'm a sort of personality made up of curiosity. And when the opportunity came along, I just was completely fascinated about what it would be to
Did you apply or did David ring you or did you know him?
It was a courtship, should we say.
Who was courting who, Ben?
Well, it was mutual. And the ideological element was that I had grown really aghast about how cut off from Europe and cut off and unsupportive of that geopolitical Europe the United Kingdom had become, and really disappointed at the declining position and perception of the UK internationally after Brexit. And I wanted to try and contribute to an improvement of relations with the European Union and in particular France and Germany. Now, a lot of other things I would have hoped to have achieved in post, Trump put a spanner in the work, but actually he has accelerated Britain's return to being part of that team Europe. And you see that in the way that not just the leaders now have a WhatsApp group where they talk together, not just the foreign secretaries do, but the NSAs work increasingly as a team. And those old sort of mocking statements that the Americans used to make about Europe, such as Henry Kissinger going, well, if I wanted to know what Europe thought, there's no one to pick up the phone to. That's a bit passé because now Europeans are working out their positions on core issues, especially on Ukraine, together and then presenting it to the United States. And we've seen that in some pretty visually arresting moments, like the European leadership going with Zelensky to the White House after Trump's Alaska summit with Putin.
So I can take from this you think Brexit was a mistake?
I do, yeah.
And you haven't seen any benefit from it?
I think that if one looks at the economy in the aggregate and one looks at the effects that has on growth and on people's everyday lives and people's everyday opportunities, I think it is obvious that Brexit has cost the UK dear in terms of growth and in terms of influence and ability to shape events. One of the problems that this country is living with, and I think most of our problems to a degree are downriver from this, is how feeble our growth rate is. And that is in part, but not exclusively, a result of cutting ourselves off from our largest market, which is the European market, and because of all of the compounding effects of delayed investment decisions because of Brexit.
Can you give me an example of where you saw a direct link to us leaving the European Union and having that lessened influence that you describe?
I think let's pick the most contentious topic in the UK right now, which is immigration. If the UK was still in the European Union, we would be under the Dublin Protocol, which means that the small boats arriving to the UK, if any of those individuals had claimed asylum first elsewhere, could be returned to that country. Now, we can argue about how effective the Dublin Protocol is, but if the UK was still in the European Union, it could have made it much more effective with allies, and we would not have a small boat crisis to the degree that we have. And then, and this is a point that Tony Blair has made frequently, we have a rising problem with illegal immigration in this country. When we were in the European Union and we were bringing in a lot of students and cheap labour, which we need, those needs were mostly being serviced by Europeans who come as singles, marry local or go home, never bring their families, literally can't claim asylum. They literally cannot because of the countries they come from. You only needed in this country a light touch, not particularly built out asylum and processing system. You didn't need a massive system. Now, when you leave the European Union and you decide that you don't want so many students from Europe or so much labour from Eastern Europe, you want to do it global and you want to attract those from countries with poor human rights records. It could be Pakistan, it could be India, it could be Bangladesh, it could be Nigeria. You're in a situation, Tony Blair points out, where the people who are coming always bring their families, if they can, very frequently claim asylum because the human rights situation in those countries is so bad, and they never go back. So a lot of what I found myself dealing with in the Foreign Office was number 10, demanding that we take tougher measures of a country like Nigeria because of illegal immigration. Now, there's a lot of what we can do in terms of supporting their border force and in terms of getting proper cooperation for returns between embassies. But a lot of it is that people will come in as students and then they'll look at the human rights situation back home or the economic situation back home and they'll make an asylum claim. And if I came from one of those countries and I come here as a student, I might do the same myself, regardless of whether or not my claim was valid. It's not a problem that can be solved uniquely by cracking down on organised immigration crime. If you want to service the economy and universities primarily from countries with bad human rights records, you are obviously going to have more human rights claims. So that's Tony Blair's point about how Brexit has severely worsened our asylum system and means, because of the volumes we're now getting, you need to have a highly visible, very built out, very expensive asylum system, and that's how you end up with hotels in towns up and down the country and the government being forced to buy and rent accommodation for large amounts of illegal migrants.
And the great irony of all of that you've described, Ben, is that Brexit was supposedly about curbing immigration. But it's
indeed. And not only was it a bad idea, it was incredibly poorly executed by people driven by short-term, vociferous ideological statements that sort of drifted in and out of consciousness in SW1.
I mean, it's fascinating because, and I don't want to spend this podcast litigating Brexit.
I'm happy to.
Yes, well, you're on the winning side now, it would seem. But when I talk to Tories about this privately, very few of them say it's been a success. What they say is we stuffed it up, which in itself is a concession that Brexit hasn't worked for anyone, really. Does that mean Labor's going to take us back in?
I think that the time has come to look again right now at the question of whether or not we should be in the European Union's customs union. And I think we need a customs alliance with the EU. And the reason is that we're living in an age where the United States has stopped being merely cooperative with allies, it's become coercive with allies, and it's using tariffs as a tool of coercion. Trump likes to call himself tariff man, and I've lost count of the amount of times that we've been threatened with tariffs by the White House. Now, the gains economically of going into a customs union with the European Union are much more significant than these very minor deals that the government has successfully negotiated in part with the United States to reduce its own tariffs on the UK. Now, I think...
So what would a customs union mean? Does it mean freedom of movement, or does it just mean trading?
It doesn't. It means that we would be, in terms of... So here's actually quite an important point. There is a customs union in abstract, which is, you are a single tariff area and you do your trading policy together. And a customs union with the EU is that, but it's also a bit more. The EU in the customs unions that it has negotiated, such as with Turkey, does a huge amount of regulatory alignment with that country, where a lot more economic gains are to be made. So I think the time has come to look at something inspired by the Turkish model with between the EU and Ankara, and to do that very quickly now as one of the single best things that we could do to increase our economic growth in the years running up to an election. I think we need to be much bolder and not stick to the Labour Party's existing red lines on Europe.
So that's really interesting, because when I talk to Europeans about this, they say you can't be cakeist. And there is a fear, I think, too, in Britain, on the British side, that the Europeans would punish or want to make an example of Britain having left. They'd give you a ringer. It would be a high cost to go back in any sort of way.
I don't think that's true in terms of would we be punished. I think that actually right about sort of cakeism, and the Europeans rightly want to protect the integrity of the single market and the integrity of their union. There are several models that the EU has offered its partners which are mutually strengthening. One is a customs union, such as it has with Turkey, and then you have the so-called Norway model, where Norway is in the single market. If you go for a customs union with the EU, I think that's a good idea to do now, because it would not just be an economic policy, it would also be a security and a resilience policy for our supply chains in an age where the United States is increasingly coercive. And let's be honest, Brexit was in a lot of ways a bet and a dream and an aspiration about the United States, which no longer matches up with reality.
And China. I mean, I remember
Yes.
talking to Brexiteers back then, and they were talking about a free trade deal with China. You don't hear any of those people say that now, because they're the biggest China hawks in town.
Exactly. I remember some really quite extraordinary and bizarre commentary by David Davis on what Brexit would mean as sort of fully integrated supply chains with China and others in East Asia. I can totally agree with you that there was a dream of a sort of British return to Asia, not particularly grounded in reality, that was in Brexit. Now, it tells what the Europeans think. I've had conversations with a lot of European advisors and European ministers and leaders on this. Let's just be honest. There's only one country in Europe that would even dream of kicking out some fuss about the UK's return to the EU, and that's France. And to assume that about France right now is just totally ignorant about French politics.
Well. I mean, they are denying you entry into SAFE, which is the big rearmament fund.
Let's talk about that in a second. But if the UK came back in some way to Europe, it would be one of the finest achievements of French foreign policy and one of the finest hours of the EU in the world, and it would vastly strengthen Macron and his successors' hands against their own populists. Now, onto this question of SAFE, I think it's important to look at what's behind that. And what we see behind that is the issue of defence industries. So defence industries and how nationally autonomous your defence industry are really hugely important questions. And we've seen those points illustrated very vividly over the last few years, because if you buy material or weapons or technological systems from one country, they retain a license over it, and that country can not permit you to use that license, as the UK did towards Israel with certain weapon systems. Now, the same applies to all of the weapons that Europeans have bought from the United States. And if you are highly integrated into American supply chains, it does limit your autonomy from the United States. And the situation that the French have been trying to avoid since de Gaulle is to have a fully autonomous French defence industry and fully autonomous French weapons.
Quite wise, really, looking at today.
They have always worried, looking at the UK defence industry, that BAE Systems is effectively an American company, and that too much integration with the UK would lead to too much American influence inside the European defence market and would lead to a situation where there was no European defence autonomy, but merely more by American. So that's the issue there.
That's not unreasonable, really.
Of course, it's not unreasonable, but in terms of building up European autonomy for the future, you do need Britain there and you do need the British defence industry there. And the question is can we come to some political decisions and some political reorientation of our defence industries to make them more European? And I think that is quite important.
Tell me what happened with Peter Mandelson from your point of view. How on earth did it get to this?
Well, I always thought it was a terrible idea and advised against it. I was very concerned.
Why?
I was very concerned about his relationships with China now, and I thought that the photo of him with Epstein was just disqualifying. Now, what's happened is a deeply regrettable, in ways very sad, consequence of his lies and his deceit. And it's had a terribly bad effect on the Labour government. I can tell you a little bit about what he was like in post, because he did actually once block a proposal I was making coming up the system as regards Australia and other Commonwealth partners. I had become very interested in how, in an age of American erraticism and unreliability, I felt that there was much more that you could do in the so-called CANZUK format, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and that we could do more together in terms of meeting, sharing advice and working on areas together where the Americans had pulled out, from electoral interference to development aid. And I was sort of trying to put a submission up.
So, sign me up. I'm number one fan of this idea, Ben.
Great. Well, I'm a big fan too. I was sort of preparing in the Foreign Office a sort of submission to go up and working on it with the teams, that we should start using the brand and we should start having a family photo of CANZUK foreign ministers at NATO, where actually they were all there at NATO, and that we should start using it in statements, and it would have a good leadership effect for the UK and a good sign that the West was tied together, not simply by the European Union, but other frameworks. And he strongly disliked the idea and meant it progressed little.
Do we know why he didn't
Well,
like
he told
it?
me, which is that he was very worried it was four eyes, it was five eyes without the Americans, and he questioned why I was so interested in what he called the old white Commonwealth countries. And, the ambassador to Washington is a very powerful figure, and the proposal that eventually went up was much weaker than I would have liked, reflecting his input. And that is one of my experiences of working with Peter Mandelson.
So 2 questions related to your answers. When you had all these misgivings about him, why was that advice not heard? I mean, you're hired for your advice. What happened in the system that you were ignored?
I wasn't, I was just a one advisor in a system, and, there's no point regretting that you weren't more...
But you sent that opinion up, right?
Well, no, you don't. These are just conversations that were had. I was not somebody with the authority or the position to make sort of formal submissions like that. That was just
What about your boss, David Lammy?
Well, the reporting that you would have seen about him reflects that situation, which is that he was very much pushing other candidates for that post.
So the second question related to your answer there is he effectively blocks a very good idea, by the way, of yours. He was having power over foreign policy in a way that perhaps exceeded his remit?
I don't think so. He was the ambassador to Washington, and if a proposal is coming up on something like that, any ambassador to Washington would have had their view in the paper, and the paper went out and said something like, Ben thinks this, the rest of the system thinks that, the ambassador thinks that, the Foreign Office advice leaned more towards where his position was. And I do think actually that most people of his generation would have made the same view had they been in that position. I don't think it was uniquely him, but was sort of sceptical of the beginnings of CANZUK, shall we put it, because there was and is a lot of nervousness about being seen to do anything that is four eyes, not five eyes.
And also, I think Labor does have some aversion ideologically to Commonwealth overtones.
I think that there's a big problem in our foreign policy debate, which is that the right is way too phobic and allergic of doing anything with the Europeans, and the left is way too phobic and allergic of doing anything in that CANZUK format, when actually you need to do both. You need to deepen your cooperation with the EU, and we can argue about where exactly the line should fall. Is it customs union, single market, or full rejoin? Those are political and economic decisions with trade-offs. And we can argue about how deep or vulnerable a kind of CANZUK partnership is, but there's definitely a light and loose one, which I think is there for the taking. But it's just not an idea that Labour has sort of felt comfortable with. And one of the things I was trying to do was actually go, this is a pretty progressive idea. You've got progressive or liberal governments in most of those countries. And when we did do progressive things like evolve our position on Palestine, a lot of it was done, even though it didn't have the branding, in a format of those countries' European partners. So I think that this reflects a sort of weakness in our foreign policy debate. And it's not just a British problem. I think it's a sort of more international problem. Maybe it's even common to all kinds of countries, which is, we talk a lot about the need to do more with middle powers. Now, I think that sort of obscures more than it reveals, which is there are a hell of a lot of middle powers, from Brazil to Mexico to Saudi Arabia to, by some measures, Thailand or beyond. Now, there are actually a very restricted amount of countries that you are going to be able to build common capability with and who genuinely share your views when it comes to the superpowers, when it comes to the United States, China, and the kind of the Russian great power and great menace that it is from the Kremlin. And those countries are really just the European Union and its associates and the CANZUK countries, and then in a very restricted way, important but limited, South Korea and Japan. And I learned that lesson in the Foreign Office because when I came in, I was quite naive in thinking that a lot of what we were going to be doing was sort of building partnerships with Brazil and Indonesia, and there's a lot you can do with those countries. And we did good work there, and we have stronger diplomatic engagement than we did before. But those countries are fundamentally in a different geopolitical space, and I think that it would help our strategy if we were clearer on the partners that we need to be doing the most work with.
I'm giving you a lot of amens here. I mean, you are preaching to a choir here, Ben. I just wish you were back in government with maybe even a more senior position.
Without Peter Mandelson to stop me.
Yes, exactly. Did he stop you on anything relating to China? Because I've been puzzling deeply over why Labor, and I watched your foreign policy grow and evolve when you were in opposition very, very closely. I've watched China in this country since I got here in 2016. And Labor went from a party that was quite strong. It was supporting a declaration of genocide in Xinjiang. It was very hawkish on a lot of positions. It promised this audit, which has never seen the light of day. I don't
So let me tell you where our China policy...
understand it.
Sure. Let me tell you where our China policy and our China thinking came from, which certainly wasn't from Peter Mandelson. And when we were in opposition, we spent a lot of time studying where the UK was on China and where our other, sort of G7, G10 partners were on China. And we saw that the UK had become an outlier in terms of engaging in diplomacy with the Chinese. Now, I hate the word engagement. It's a word from the 1990s. It implies transformation and change through contact. But in terms of just diplomacy, Churchill wanted to meet Stalin to discuss nuclear weapons, and British leaders were often having summitry with the Soviet Union. I don't think there's anything wrong in engaging in diplomacy with China.
And you will never hear that from me either. I'm not one of these people that says you shouldn't go to China.
The UK had found itself in a situation where before James Cleverly, previous Foreign Secretary before David Wong, there'd been so many, had gone to Beijing. No UK official had actually gone since the pandemic. And if you compared that to how many times the Australian leadership was going or the Democratic leadership was going, it was just complete different. And one of the voices the voices pushing for the need for just more diplomacy were actually a lot of them were hawkish voices, and actually a lot of those sort of security, the more security side of the House, because they felt the UK needed to be sending tough messages to the Chinese on questions like Russia. Now, we spent a lot of time studying how the Australians did it, and I would say that they were our inspiration. And and my colleagues spent a lot of time talking to Australian officials about how exactly they calibrated their China policy. So we wanted to get to a situation where that we were engaging in diplomacy like the rest of our peer countries, but we were still far more cautious than they were on a lot of the economics. And that is where we are today. Now, I think the government's broad China policy has been good, but I think it could have communicated it a bit better and anchored it in a kind of broader, stronger effort to talk about this very alarming situation which is developing internationally, which is just as Trump fractures and undermines and damages the Western alliance, the authoritarian axis is deepening its cooperation. And you see the Russians providing targeting support to Iran, the Chinese providing diplomatic support and other support to Iran. You see the North Koreans providing men and material and shells to the Russians to fight in Ukraine. And you see the Chinese providing non-lethal aid to Russia. Now, when I say non-lethal, I mean literally everything apart from the bullet they are providing to the Russians. And let me tell you, based on the material that I saw inside that is classified, the Russians would have lost that war had it not been for the Chinese. And in due course, a lot of that information will come out, though possibly not now on this podcast. Now, I'm concerned. I'm very concerned about a situation which David Lammy, when he was still in opposition, flagged in a speech that he gave on a visit that he did to Washington, is that if we look back at Brzezinski and the grand chessboard's great sort of warning of what would be the most dangerous situation for the United States in the 21st century, what Brzezinski identified was that you could see a sort of an alliance of overlapping and complementary grievances, he put it, with China as the leading power and Russia as the junior power, tying together them and North Korea and Iran, which have extreme influence across Eurasia. And what we're seeing is that kind of growing in strength. And I do think that Labour could have been stronger in communicating that. And David did try a lot to communicate that. You look at his speeches and the visits he took to Japan and South Korea and Indonesia and elsewhere. But really, I would have wanted the Prime Minister to talk a bit about it.
So a couple of things on that. Well, where is the audit? Why do we never see it? I think that would have helped you. Was that never going to be released?
The China audit? Well, let me talk a little bit about what's behind that and what's the inspiration behind that.
And what did you actually audit?
So every government in the Biden era, shall we put it, did some kind of audit on their relationship with China. A very successful one was done by von der Leyen in terms of mapping dependencies and vulnerabilities. The United States did one, again, pretty highly classified stuff, inside the National Security Council, really mapping these vulnerabilities from kind of software to hardware, imports to exports. Germans did one, the French did one. Now, the UK was going to need to do one. It was going to have to do some kind of analysis of vulnerabilities. And if you're going to do a serious piece of work like that, it does have to be classified. It's just the nature of it. Because if you don't, there's no point in mapping your vulnerabilities if you're going to shout about them and tell the Chinese what they are. So one of the things that I learned doing this role is that when it comes to foreign policy, just really hard to communicate a lot of the things you're doing and why, because so much stuff is classified and because there is so much information, so much that's going on in the world that the public don't know. So you're forced constantly into these sort of ellipses and silences and kind of policies that look incomprehensible often to the public.
So one small example that's not classified, though. The EU and the US have put tariffs on Chinese EVs because this is a market where there is overcapacity. The Chinese state subsidises it, and pretty soon we're all going to be out of car making. Australia already is, for example. Why did Britain not follow that sort of a policy, for example?
So, Chinese so-called overcapacity, which we all know is a strategic endeavour to try and bankrupt a lot of competitive manufacturing around the world, is exactly the kind of topic that has been buried by the Trump administration's antics in the sort of Western political consciousness. And what we saw in the age when Jake Sullivan was in the White House was that the United States was painstakingly trying to build a global green industrial regulatory coalition to check China, and was drawing attention to a lot of these matters. In the run-up to Trump coming into the White House, there was a lot of sort of projection and fantasy onto him of coherent anti-Chinese politics that just were never there. He doesn't have the Republican Party's views on China. He has his own views and his own interests in China. Xi Jinping's my friend. Come to my inauguration. He's seeking deals. He's the guy that was releasing NVIDIA's top chips to the Chinese. And it shocks me that some of that fantasy still lingers in foreign policy commentary. Now, I think that, if the United States had remained focused on building that global coalition and on matters like Chinese overcapacity, and hadn't adopted such a coercive and frankly mercenary attitude towards its allies, people like myself who are very worried about that would have been able to make a stronger case in Whitehall about this.
That's really interesting. That confirms everything I've suspected about the effects of all of this. What do you see as the future of US-UK relations?
I think it's important to just sort of get our categorization right, which is what the public think of or the press talk about as the special relationship. The idea that we have some special access, or the United States does us special favors politically, that doesn't really exist. And what does exist is that we have a unique specialist relationship with the United States when it comes to MI6 and the CIA, GCHQ and NSA, and when it comes to nuclear weapons, and of course, Trident. Now, and there are some other aspects of security we have a unique relationship to. There is a special relationship between people, between language, between heritage, and between a lot of business, but it's not the same as a political special relationship. I think it's very unfortunate that Paul Christian Turner, our new and excellent ambassador in Washington, was recorded by some student scamp and had his comments released to the press.
Are you the next one that Keir Starmer's going to say? Because Keir Starmer seems to like sacking everybody except himself.
I think that this is a classic case of it's unfortunate. It was not intentional. And our top civil servants have the right, when speaking as, in private, to be analytically honest.
So he wasn't wrong, you're saying, in what he said?
Well, I think what he said was not only accurate, I think half the cabinet agree with him. And we want our top ambassadors to have independence of mind and be able to give accurate analysis in meetings that they believe are private. What's gone wrong here, and if I was still in a position of the small influence I had in the Foreign Office, I would be insisting that they get their mobile phone protocol right. So if you go into Downing Street, they take your phone away. If you go into the Foreign Office, leave it on you. Sorry, can you put it in this bowl? And they only take it away from you when you go into a high security area, because they're only thinking about the strategic threat from Russia or China or people hacking into your phone. They're not thinking about scamps that could do recordings and embarrass politicians. Now, if you go into Downing Street, take your phone away immediately. And that is because they're quite conscious that this thing could happen. And when you go into the embassy in DC, you should have your phone taken away from you, and they need to get that protocol right. Otherwise, there'll be copycats against poor Dr. Turner and other of our excellent ambassadors around the world.
Yeah, I feel sorry for him too. The journalist in me appreciated the story, but
But in terms of America's relationships, the United States, I think he's correct that the United States' political special relationship right now is with Israel. But the United States is a very different country. It's not only the country of the old planters and Jamestown and that song which Trump himself was singing in the White House yesterday during the royal visit. This is an America that's been transformed by not only the long tail of the Ellis Island immigration, but also the long tail of the Hart-Celler immigration after 1965. And America now has two other very real special relationships that are demographically rooted, and one is with Mexico and the other is with Israel. And you see with both of those, there's a business special relationship and a cultural special relationship. Now, what's the future of those special relationships politically? Now, Mexico has never had a special relationship politically, and it's used to a lot of coercion by the United States, because the United States has never considered it a sort of tier one ally, and the United States has always been very coercive against those it does not consider its allies. Now, I think that Israel in a lot of ways is the last special relationship politically, but if you look at the future of the United States, the democracy is changing. The United States is turning away from Protestantism, and a lot of that had undergirded the sort of relationship with Israel. The United States is not demographically the same country as it was in the 1960s or even the 1990s. And support for Israel on the other side of the intense collaboration that they're doing over Iran right now is cratering on both the left and the right. And I expect the next president, whether it's on the right or the left, to be pretty coercive towards Israel too. So I don't see any of these political special relationships surviving the deeper we go into the 21st century. I don't see any new ones emerging either.
Do you see NATO surviving? Because I am not so sure. When I go to Munich, when I went to NATO in The Hague, the next generation weren't showing up. There were retiring congressmen and women who were there. And I don't see, after everything that Trump has said and done about NATO, that there's a lot of pushback in the US around it.
I think that the United States' commitment to NATO as an institution and membership of NATO, I think that is solid. I think it's very solid in Congress. I don't see that.
Even after Greenland?
For the moment, I think it is. Could it be questioned? Could something dramatic happen? It's the Trump era. Of course something dramatic could happen. But for the moment, I feel it's solid. And I feel that even Trump himself quite likes having it there, and the structure it brings and the symmetry and the extremely sort of gratifying experience to sit in that room with the NATO leaders around you and feel like king of the West. I felt that he enjoyed that when I saw him engaging in that. Now, he may threaten and use the United States membership as a source of leverage and coercion, but I don't think we're really at a point where withdrawal is a serious possibility. Though, look, he's very unstable and erratic. Things could happen. But if we stick on the current trend line, I don't think they will. Now, having said that, formal membership, institutional membership, commitment to shape and deployments, I think there are sort of two trends. One is that despite a lot, on the other side of all this huffling and puffling over Iran, the Americans are realizing how crucial all those bases are in Europe, because they couldn't fight this war without those bases in Europe. So that strengthens the Americans staying in or keeping the relationships of Europe going. But on the other side, I do think that a deterrence gap and a bit of a NATO credibility gap, if I'm honest, is opening up vis-a-vis the Russians. And I do think that touches on the ultimate question, which is the nuclear question. So I don't think that the deterrence gap is at the end of a war. I don't think that the Americans are not going to show up if the Russians are threatening to nuke London. I can't imagine a scenario where they wouldn't allow the United Kingdom to threaten to use Trident to ward off something cataclysmic like that. The Americans love the ultimate sovereignty that their nuclear shield provides Europe. And I think if ever the UK homeland was under that kind of threat, I think that the United States would be with us. I think there's a deterrence gap there at the beginning of a war, and I can imagine a scenario where little green men have popped up in Estonia and the Russians come in and they overwhelm the garrison, and a figure like Tucker Carlson is president, or a figure like Nick Fuentes is like just so much bigger than they are now that the United States doesn't want to show up. And you can see some of those negative tendencies on the Democrats with the rise of Hassan Piker and other cricket crawlies like that. I don't think that we have, as the United Kingdom, the deterrence we need in that situation, which is we don't have currently in our nuclear arsenal what we used to have, which was aircraft-delivered tactical nuclear weapons that NATO could use on the battlefield or threaten to use on the battlefield. So the Russians would believe that even if they could overwhelm our armies, they would lose the battle anyways. There was no point even trying.
I thought you were moving to delivering nuclear weapons from air. I thought that was a policy decision you made.
We don't currently have that as a capability, and we don't have a capability that's autonomous from the Americans, which is the point that I was driving at and I should have been clear about. And I think that what we need is an aircraft-delivered nuclear missile that is fully 100% autonomous from the United States that we could threaten to use at the beginning of a war if such an eventuality happened.
With the French, or?
I think we should do it with the French.
Which brings us back to our earlier points.
And it would be extremely expensive, but it wouldn't be cripplingly expensive. Like, it's just not affordable to try and build a completely UK-only Trident. It would be 5% of GDP, and it would take, 7 or 8 years. A lot of it's to do with the testing. You can't just blow up bombs in the Pacific anymore. You've got to test it and simulate it in far more restrictive ways. And we've got very, very limited capacity of people who know how to do this. But I think a sort of tactical nuclear weapon that could be delivered by air, developed with the French, you could get something like a Typhoon jet, reverse engineer a Storm Shadow, put something on it, and could be deployed quite quickly. I mean, in military terms, talking 4 or 5 years, but it'd be expensive. It wouldn't break the national budget, so to speak. And I think that plugs our deterrence gap.
What is Britain waiting for? Your government talked a really good game. I was quite excited by some of the things Sir Keir was saying at the start of his premiership about wanting to be this national security prime minister. What's happened?
I think that this government, like previous governments, has come up against a couple of realities of office. One is that the MOD is incredibly bad, shockingly bad at managing public funds, and the Treasury is correctly very, very reticent to writing them black checks until they get their house in order. I think carrying on from that, there's a question about where's this money actually going to go, into what defence industry, into the American defence industry, into the European defence industry, into some new defence industry that we're trying to build up. I think those are all really good questions. I don't think they've been ironed out at all. And the country's under extreme financial stress because it has no growth. So I think a lot of that has happened. Now, if you look at the public, we have a problem, which is the public doesn't share the threat assessment that the political class
It's because we haven't told them.
So I agree with that, and I spent a lot of time in government saying that we need to declassify more, we need to tell people what's going on, and we need to be much more liberal the way the Americans are. And I don't think the politicians pushed enough to get things declassified, and I don't think we had a moment where the Prime Minister stood in front of a big map of the Russian defence industry. These are how many tanks they're being built. These are where they're murdering people. These are where they have operations that are really terrifying to our way of life. And this is what they're doing. I think that moment has not happened. Ultimately, I'm increasingly concerned that we're not going to get that level of defence expenditure we need until the public feels it's in a complete crisis. And the public feels tangibly that crisis has arrived, which it simply does not right now.
Yeah, I think that's very concerning. One of the constant themes of what you are saying, Ben, today is that you talk about this almost overwhelming feeling being in the system. I wonder if your model is stacked wrong. In Australia, we have a much more political system operating in government. Ministerial advisors are politically appointed. They can come from the bureaucracy, but they can also act as either department liaison, so they can be from the bureaucracy, or they can adapt and morph and be political as well. And in my time observing the British system, you simply do not have enough political decision makers.
I mean, 100%. I couldn't agree with you more. We have sort of basically two institutional design problems in this country. The first is that we're the most centralised country in the developed world, but all that power is centralised on top of basically a tiny, incredibly weak and malfunctioning executive. Number 10 is not a modern executive. It is a glorified private office designed and staffed for the old era of cabinet government, when the role has become that of a premier and that increasingly of a presidential figure. Number 10 does not have the staffing and does not have the tools and control over the system that Australia with the Department of the Prime Minister has, or that Australia with, I believe there are about 400 political appointees in the centre.
And by the way, they get paid pretty well.
Well,
I like
great.
that.
Maybe if they paid better, I could be tempted back faster than I was expecting in the future government. But
But I mean, all seriousness, that matters. I want my advisors paid well.
There's not enough studying of the Australian system or awareness of the Australian system here. And I wish people would look at it as a Westminster system that has evolved and I think delivered really well for its people over the last few decades. And the other aspect of the Australian system, which I admire, is obviously we've got different heritage, different background. We wouldn't want to get to the same level that Australia has. It's obviously a lot more decentralized. And I think that we need to move in a direction where local government is strengthened again in the UK. If you go back to the early 20th century, municipal boards and local government was very strong and delivering a lot of things. It's been incredibly hollowed out and incredibly tightly controlled and delivers shockingly little compared to Westminster. No other country in the developed world has local government with as little tax raising power. And people are surprised when the public use local elections to vent their frustrations about foreign policy, because what's the difference? These politicians will be implementing a lot of the same thing because they're regulatory requirements. And I think that we need to move towards a situation where instead of having this bizarre, balkanized, bespoke, totally confusing devolution within England, we have a situation where all the main identifiable regions have a system a bit more like Manchester, where they have a mayor and they have clear regional competencies and they need more tax-raising power. And I look to Australia as an example and inspiration.
We'll have to get you out there. Ben, 2 more questions before we finish. One, given everything you've said, particularly about the MOD, should Australians trust Britain with all the billions we're giving your industry to deliver us AUKUS?
I think that it really depends on all the different bits. I was making a kind of crude generalization there. Really, it's like a galaxy in there of different suppliers and different contracts and different managers of public funds. I think that the bits that deals with the crown jewels of the British state, so to speak, with submarines and with nuclear, I think that is working. And I would have confidence in that. But, I just want to take this opportunity to say something about AUKUS, which is...
Would you have signed up to it?
The way that I look at the world is, do you need this piece of military kit for a war against China, which you're never going to fight, apart from with the United States or with Australia? If it's a piece of kit that you need for that war against China, a hypothetical, or deterring China, it's totally fine to do it with Lockheed Martin and to do it with the Australians. Do you need it for some hypothetical, terrible situation in the Middle East, a war with Iran, or some kind of intervention that might have to happen? You're never going to do that without the United States, and it's totally fine to buy that piece of kit with the Americans. Is it something that you need to be able to fight or threaten to fight a war autonomously of some future Tucker Carlson president against the Russians to defend the Baltic? Well, then actually you should be doing that with the Europeans, because you want to have those critical aspects you want to be more autonomous on. And those are things like ISR, surveillance for the battlefield, to provide targeting, and things like this sort of limited tactical nuclear weapons that you can threaten and deter. Don't you think that you can overwhelm my forces and get away with it on the battlefield? Now, a point on AUKUS I want to make, which is, because of that, that's my framework. I believe in AUKUS, and I think that AUKUS needs to be accompanied by the kind of public diplomacy effort explaining what it is, which accompanied early NATO. So early NATO had these NATO information offices, and there was a conscious effort through places like my old shop, the Atlantic Council. That's where it comes from. To explain NATO and build legitimacy for NATO, which was originally quite an unpopular alliance in parts of Europe. It wasn't really understood what it was and why it was there. And I think that AUKUS needs that kind of explanation. And I think that there's one thing that's really one thing where we missed a trick. And I think that you could have rolled out sort of AUKUS information offices and in that model and done a lot more. Now, I kind of on, sort of pillar 2 and on the technology side of it, I'm currently a bit concerned that they're kind of spreading bets a bit too widely. Really, they need to pick a couple of strong pieces of tech and just deliver it and concentrate on the tech and not get so lost in the should we invite this country or that country or expand it, get lost in the diplomacy. But coming back to the core point, which is, do Australia and the UK need to be doing more together in the 21st century? I think the answer is absolutely, because the changes that happened in the United States are permanent. The deep foreign policy consensus that existed there has gone. I believe the Democrats will come back to power. I don't believe it's a permanent Trump regime. But what Trump's done to the American right means that they're changed permanently. That kind of politics endures. And we're going to have two Americas. One America that's purely cooperative of allies, and one that's going to be much more coercive towards allies. There's going to be a lot more isolationist. And in that context, you need to do more CANZUK and more Europe if you're the UK. And I think there are lots of defence things that we need to do more with Australia and more with Canada. And I hope that the way that AUKUS has become such a successful piece of summitry that one idea that I proposed, and which sort of died on its arse, got nowhere, was to try and see if we could create some Canadian element to AUKUS, like inviting some Canadians for the last day, or trying to find some defence projects that maybe not at the same level of representation, but to bring them in on, where necessary and where we could do things in a trilateral format.
Actually, now I've just got one little follow-up on that. Do we depend on you in a contingency with China on Taiwan?
I remember having conversations with politicians, let's just leave it at that, talking about how there is a real risk of conflict in Asia, and explaining that if China goes to war with the United States over Taiwan, the United States will use Australia essentially as a giant aircraft carrier. And the moment Australia comes under attack from China, the UK Prime Minister will survive 1 second without going to the defence of Australia, regardless of what he thinks about it. It will be that the British public will demand action to defend Australia more than they have ever demanded action to defend a Poland or a Belgium or a France in their history. So I think, yes, the UK and Australia can depend on each other, but I think that they need to work much harder to build a lot of that common military infrastructure.
I don't know why, but I just felt very touched by that. That was really, really nice to hear you say it like that. Okay, the question I get asked every time I'm talking to Australians, what is wrong with Keir Starmer and how on earth can this guy last? You've seen him up close. What went wrong?
I don't want to sort of get into sort of the sort of running commentary about.
No, I know, but it's clear to everybody
that
it's not working.
I want to zoom out and think about the big picture of Labour. When the Labour Party came to power in 1945, in 1964, in 1997, they had a very clearly worked out project that all stacked together, that was very thoroughly worked out, that contained within it a real critique of the state, of public services, and what we were going to do with it. Attlee, NHS and nationalisation. Wilson comes in, it's the white heat of technology. He invents the SPAD, brings these creatures into Whitehall to try and control these departments. Tony Blair, it's the third way. And I don't think that the Labour Party quite had that coming into government. And I think that there's been a real lack of a central theory of how to deal with the challenges in the British state. And I think that's created a lot of frustration between the government and the civil service. So let me tell you what some of the old timers, big beasts of the civil service told me, when we were starting, which was when Thatcher came to power, they used to send her up. Whitehall works on submissions. They used to send up submissions on, Minister, you've requested advice to solve this problem. Here's the free market answer. Here's the mixed economy answer. And here's the social democratic answer. By the end of the Tories' 18 years in government, they only sent out the free market answer because they knew that no one would have any interest in the others. And with Tony Blair, it's the same thing. They only, at the end of it, sent out the third way answer. And all of the ants in all of the councils, in all of the departments were marching behind that vision. Now, with the government we've currently got, you've got some ministers going for a kind of progressive futurism, the techno-optimist answer. You've got some going for the old Labour tax and spend answer. You've got some going for the Blairite third way answer. And without a kind of compelling framework for what you want to reform and do with the state, it's going to be really difficult to be Prime Minister.
Ben Judah, I could have spent another hour talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. That's one of my favourite interviews I've done.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.